Miss Bell, what exactly are you doing in my kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning? The voice was cold, clipped, and carried the weight of command. Zariah Bell froze. Her fingers clutched a crystal wine glass still slick with soap, her hands raw from the scalding water. She hadn't heard him enter. Now, Edward Langston stood at the kitchen threshold, tall, imposing, wrapped in a dark silk robe, and staring at her like she was a question he didn't expect to find. Zariah turned slowly, instinctively straightening her spine, though her heart was racing. I'm sorry, Mr. Langston. I didn't mean... That wasn't my question, he interrupted. Why are you here? Her mouth opened, but the words stumbled. My mother, she's been really sick lately. I came to help her. She was worried about the dishes from tonight, and I didn't want her to get in trouble, so I thought... Langston stepped forward into the pale yellow light cast by the stove hood. His face, lined by years and shadows, remained unreadable. He said nothing, just looked at her. The truth was more complicated than she could fit into one breath. It hadn't started with the dishes. 2 weeks ago, Zariah had walked into class late again, her eyes ringed with exhaustion, her shirt wrinkled from sleeping in it. Miss Drexler, her English teacher, gave her that look again, half pity, half contempt. Miss Bell, she said loudly in front of the whole class. Perhaps if you spent less time socializing and more time on your assignments, you wouldn't be failing. There was no socializing. There was only work, and pain, and fear. At lunch, she'd sat alone as always, not because she wanted to, but because the white girls at the honors table had once made it very clear she wasn't welcome. One of them, Becky, had laughed as Zariah approached. Sorry, this table's for future Georgetown students, not maids in training. Zariah hadn't told her mother. Gloria Bell had been coughing so much she couldn't sleep through the night. Her hands were so swollen she couldn't twist open pill bottles. Her insurance wouldn't cover the new medication, and they didn't have the $900 needed for a single month's supply. 3 days ago, Zariah had gone to the pharmacy and begged the clerk, an older man with a red face and no patience. Just a few days, she whispered. I'll come back Friday. I have a job, I swear. I'll pay. He didn't let her finish. This isn't a soup kitchen. You think you can pay with tears, sweetheart? When she still didn't leave, he leaned closer and hissed. You people always have some sob story. Come back with money or don't come at all. Mo. As she turned, humiliated, her eyes blurred with tears. Her elbow caught the corner of a display rack. She slipped, landed hard. Her knee scraped open, jeans torn. He didn't help her up, just muttered something about calling security next time. She limped home, told her mother she'd fallen on the sidewalk. Gloria, too sick to argue, just nodded weakly. That same night, their landlord knocked. A short, angry man with breath that stank of beer and bitterness. Rent's due tomorrow. You're already a week behind. No money, no keys. Zariah had said nothing, she just nodded. And now, here she was. At 2 a.m., in a kitchen the size of her entire apartment, washing dishes that had held food she hadn't tasted in years. Langston's eyes moved past her to the deep sink stacked with pans and platters, remnants of a 20-person catered dinner. His gaze dropped to her hands, bright red and cracked. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was a precise one. And what he saw didn't add up. You're not on the payroll, he said after a long silence. No, sir, Zariah replied, her voice tightening. But I help my mom. Sometimes, when she's sick. Why not sleep? You have school in the morning. Her shoulders twitched. Yes, sir. You flinched when I asked. Her lips trembled. She looked down. Edward Langston had made billions reading hesitation. That microsecond of doubt across a boardroom table, he built ships around it, bet futures on it. And this girl, she was all hesitation. He followed her gaze. An old backpack lay near the back entrance, frayed at the seams. A gold and blue honor cord dangled from the zipper. Valedictorian, a symbol of achievement. Beside it, half tucked into a mesh pocket, was a worn photograph in a cracked plastic frame. A soldier, black, proud, staring out in sepia tones from decades ago. Langston frowned. Something inside him stirred an echo from a war he'd never fought but had lived in its shadow all his life. "Leave the dishes," he said finally. Zarya blinked. "Sir? Leave them. Go home. Sleep. I'll speak to your mother. But she'll be in trouble if... That's not your concern. You're a child. Go home." There was no room for argument in his tone. She nodded, pulled off her wet apron, slid the backpack onto one aching shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, and slipped out the service door into the cold darkness. Langston remained still. He looked at the dishes, the honor cord, the old photo. Then he whispered to no one, "She should be sleeping, not scrubbing my crystal at 2 a.m. He turned toward his study. The book he carried dropped onto a chair, untouched. He didn't try to sleep again. He sat at his desk, staring out into the night, as questions lined themselves up like soldiers on a battlefield. And when the clock struck 5, he reached for the phone, because something was broken, and he hated broken patterns. If this story touched you, hit like and drop a comment with where you're watching from. You never know, someone nearby might be watching too. Edward Langston had never been a sentimental man. Not in the traditional sense. His wealth had been built on logic, foresight, and the ability to see 2, sometimes 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. He had never believed in omens, but when he sat in his leather chair that night, the image of that worn backpack with the honor cord wouldn't leave him. That cord was not just decoration, it was a badge, an emblem of excellence, of relentless effort and sacrifice. He knew what it meant to earn it, how many sleepless nights, skipped parties, missed weekends it represented, and now, the girl who carried it was scrubbing dishes alone in a kitchen designed for white-gloved caterers. He had tried to return to his reading, but the words on the page swam uselessly. The image of her hands raw, trembling, and the tremor in her voice stayed with him. So at 5:02 a.m., he picked up the phone and dialed the only man he trusted with things that mattered. "George," he said as soon as the line clicked. His assistant's voice came through groggily but controlled. "Mr. Langston? Is everything all right? I need a file on Gloria Bell and her daughter. Her name is Zarya. About 17, maybe 18. Find out everything. School, attendance, GPA, future plans. I also want to know about Gloria's recent absences. Her work has been inconsistent." There was a pause. George never paused unless he needed to choose his words. "I was preparing a report for you, actually. Gloria's sick leave has increased significantly over the past month. I was going to recommend a temporary replacement." "Put that file away," Edward said. "No disciplinary action. Not yet." Understood. I'll get you what you need. School records may take some digging, but I'll have a preliminary summary on your desk by this afternoon." "One more thing," Edward added. "Zarya's backpack. She had a photo in it. Black and white. A man in uniform. Look into him. 101st Airborne Division if I saw correctly." "Veteran?" George asked. "Possibly. There's a connection there. I'm not sure what it is yet, but dig." He hung up and sat back, steepling his fingers. The mansion, quiet and cavernous, now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a monument to blind spots. What else had he missed? Adopt, Trizitja, men, Gloria didn't come in. Edward noticed the absence immediately. Normally, he wouldn't have. Staff rotated. They worked in the background, kept to their routines. But now, every plate left untouched on the breakfast table, every unpolished corner, seemed to whisper her name. At 10 a.m., he told George to skip the scheduled operations briefing. "Just email me the bullet points," he said. "I'm not in the mood to talk about shipping lanes today." By 4 p.m., George returned in person. He never returned in person unless it was important. He entered the study, holding a thin manila folder with both hands. His face was unreadable calm, as always, but a little heavier around the eyes. "You were right to be concerned," George said quietly. He placed the folder on the desk, slid it forward. Edward opened it. The first page was a printout from the North Bay School District. At the top, Zarya Bell, North Bay High School. Beneath that, a photo. Zarya beaming, holding a certificate. Her smile was wide, unguarded. It didn't match the girl who'd scrubbed wine glasses in silence the night before. "She's not just a good student," George said. "She was the valedictorian of her class." GPA 4, full academic scholarship to Georgetown University. Presidential scholar, top 1% of students in the nation. Edward stared at the page. At the bright-eyed, clean version of the girl. This was the future. This was what was being sacrificed. And yet, George continued, sliding a second page across, she hasn't been to school in 26 days. No formal withdrawal. The principal has called multiple times, but the number has been disconnected. She's now flagged as truant. Georgetown has revoked the scholarship pending confirmation. Why? Edward murmured. Why would a girl like that throw everything away? George didn't answer. Instead, he placed the final page down. It was a medical notice. Gloria Bell was diagnosed with late-stage systemic lupus erythematosus. Aggressive. The new treatment she needs costs nearly $900 a month. Insurance denies coverage. Classified as experimental. Edward felt something clench in his chest. She lost her second job last month. The only income left is what she makes here. Without it, she has no benefits. No treatment. Zariah appears to have been secretly filling in for her, cleaning the house in her place. Unpaid. To keep her mother's job safe. There was silence. The weight of it filled the room like fog. Edward leaned back, staring past the desk, past the polished bookshelves, into the hollow distance of memory. He hadn't thought of Tommy in years, not in detail. His older brother, who never came home from Vietnam, and the letter, a letter written by a man from his unit. A man named Bell. Robert Bell. A medic. A quiet hero. That name. Did you look into the photo? Edward asked. George nodded. He handed over a printed copy of a military record. Captain Robert Bell, 101st Airborne Division. 2 tours. Highly decorated. Killed in 2010. Gloria's father. Edward's breath caught. My brother served in Baker Company, he said softly. That's where Bell was. George didn't speak. He didn't have to. Edward stood. Walked to the bookcase. Pulled a faded frame from behind a row of naval histories. In it, 2 young men smiled beneath the jungle sun. One of them, his brother, Tommy. The other, darker, steadier, with a hand on Tommy's shoulder. I've seen that face before, Edward whispered. He wrote my mother letters after Tommy died. He told her my brother had been brave, that he hadn't died alone. He turned, his face hardening with purpose. This isn't charity, he said. This is family, and I will not let them fall. He snapped the folder shut. Get me their address, and find out where Zariah Bell is right now. The Evening Star Diner sat on the corner of Ashland and 14th, wedged between a pawn shop and a discount mattress store. Its neon sign flickered like a heartbeat, soft, inconsistent, struggling to stay alive. The kind of place that smelled perpetually of burnt bacon and mop water. The kind of place that hadn't changed since 1975, except for the faces behind the counter. Edward Langston hadn't stepped foot in a diner in decades. He had people who brought meals to him on porcelain trays with linen napkins. But tonight, at a little past 10 p.m., he sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, trying not to wince as his knee pressed into the sticky underside of the table. He wore a simple gray coat, clean but understated. No driver, no fanfare, just him. The waitress approached, a woman in her 60s with tired eyes and a frizzy gray bun. She held a pencil between her fingers like a surgeon about to make a critical incision. What'll it be on? Coffee. Black. She nodded and shuffled off without small talk, no judgment in her eyes. Langston liked that. This wasn't a place for questions. It was a place for survival. He scanned the room. It didn't take long to spot her. Zariah moved between tables with robotic precision. Her posture was stiff, the kind you got from wearing someone else's shoes and someone else's name. Her hair was tucked beneath a blue diner cap, and her uniform was a size too big patty stitched in red over the pocket. She didn't see him. She balanced a heavy tray on one arm while refilling water glasses with the other. Her movements were fast, efficient, practiced. But Langston noticed the limp. It was subtle, a favoring of her right leg with each step. A reminder of a fall, a bruise still healing. The manager stood behind the counter, a man with the posture of a bulldog, and the face of someone who hated everyone before they had a chance to prove him wrong. He barked something at Zariah too fast for Edward to catch, but she nodded quickly and moved without hesitation. Langston watched her run. Not physically, though, her body never stopped, but emotionally. She moved like someone trying to outrun the weight of everything. He sipped his coffee. It was bitter, weak, and lukewarm. It fit the place. After 20 minutes, Zariah moved to clear the booth beside his. Her tray was already piled with dirty dishes, ketchup bottles, and crumpled napkins. Her arms trembled slightly from the weight. And that's when he said it. Zariah, just her name, soft but firm. It sliced through the clatter of silverware and murmured conversations like a thunderclap. She froze. The plate in her hand slipped. It shattered on the linoleum. Her head snapped toward the sound of her name, eyes wide in shock and dread. She stared at Langston, his face partially obscured in shadow, but unmistakable. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Her hands, still gripping the edge of the tray, began to shake. The diner went silent. Then came the voice, loud, cruel. Zariah, what the hell do you think you're doing? The manager marched from behind the counter, red-faced and furious. That's coming out of your pay. A week's worth of dishes in a single drop? Are you stupid? Or just lazy? She didn't answer. Her eyes never left Edward's. You hear me? I said that's coming out of your... That's enough. Langston's voice wasn't raised, but it stopped Mitch mid-sentence. The billionaire stood slowly, adjusting his coat. He walked calmly to where Zariah knelt, trying to gather shards of ceramic with shaking hands. Langston crouched down beside her. His knees protested, but he ignored the ache. Are you hurt? He asked gently. She didn't respond. Her fingers were bleeding, a thin red line tracing her palm. I asked if you were hurt. I'm fine, she whispered. Her voice was broken, barely human. He looked at the tray, then at her face, then at Mitch, who was still standing over them, arms crossed. She's just a kid, Langston said, and unless you want to deal with the consequences of working minors past curfew, without break, in an establishment that looks like a health code violation waiting to happen, I suggest you walk away. Mitch scoffed. And who the hell are you? Langston didn't reply. He reached into his coat and removed a leather wallet, pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills and laid them on the counter. That's for the plates, and the coffee, and your attitude. My. Mitch lunged for the bills, grumbling something under his breath. Langston turned back to Zariah. You're done here, he said. Come on. She didn't move. I can't, she whispered. I need this shift. You don't anymore. He extended his hand. She stared at it. Then, with slow, hesitant fingers, she took it. Her skin was cold, clammy with fear and grease. He pulled her to her feet. Mitch was still standing by the register, watching. She's finished, Langston said to him, and you'll never speak to her again. He guided Zariah toward the door, shielding her from the gawking patrons. Her face burned with shame, but she didn't let go of his hand. Outside, the night air was sharp. Her breath steamed. She hadn't realized how warm it had been inside, despite the stench. Langston opened the passenger door to his sedan. The seat was leather, heated, quiet. A world away from sticky booths and chipped cups. She slid in without a word. He got in beside her, closed the door. The car was a cocoon of silence. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. Your hands, he said quietly. Are they cut? She looked down. The blood was already drying. I didn't notice. He pulled the car to the curb and opened the glove compartment, removed a small first aid kit. This will sting, he said. She didn't argue. She flinched when he dabbed the alcohol, but didn't pull away. My brother used to say, he murmured, a little sting now is better than a big one later. He wrapped her hand with the same care he might handle a negotiation, deliberate, precise, measured. When he was done, he handed her a handkerchief. For your face. She took it slowly, pressed it to her cheek. The tears hadn't stopped. He pulled the car back into motion. Neither of them said another word. The city rolled by in a blur of quiet intersections and orange streetlights. Edward drove with both hands on the wheel, his knuckles white, his mind louder than the hum of the engine. Zariah sat rigid beside him, pressed against the passenger door like she might disappear into it. She clutched the handkerchief in her bandaged hand, though she'd stopped crying. Or maybe she'd just run out of tears. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was heavy, like fog before a storm. Like everything that needed saying was still too big, too close, too raw. Langston didn't turn on the radio. He didn't ask questions right away. He simply let the car glide through the night, like both of them needed a few more miles before words would work again. He glanced at her once at a red light. The diner cap was still on her head, her uniform stained with ketchup, grease, and the shame that came from being seen at your lowest. He recognized that shame. He'd worn it once, in a different life. The light turned green. The wheels moved forward. "Why Georgetown?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. Zariah blinked, startled. Her lips parted, but no answer came. "It was your school of choice, wasn't it?" He continued. "Full scholarship. Presidential scholar. That's no small thing. You worked hard to earn it. Why that school?" She cleared her throat. I wanted to study history, political science, maybe work in the State Department someday, do something that mattered." He nodded once. "A noble goal." She looked at him sideways. "But one that doesn't pay for medicine." Langston said nothing. She let out a bitter breath. "You don't understand. None of you do." "Then make me understand," he said simply. Her lips trembled. She stared at the dashboard, then out the window at the dark city. "I got the letter from Georgetown the same day Mom collapsed," she whispered. She couldn't get off the bathroom floor. She was curled up, crying. Not from pain. She was too far past that. She couldn't cry anymore. I called 911 and rode with her in the ambulance. She turned to him then. "That's the same night the pharmacy told me they wouldn't fill the prescription. The insurance didn't cover it. $900 a month. And that's not even counting the blood work, the specialist, the transportation." Langston's jaw clenched. "She tried to go back to work the next week," Zariah went on. "I found her on the kitchen floor. She'd been trying to mop and couldn't stand up. Her hands were so swollen she couldn't hold the broom." She paused. "So I did the only thing I could. I took over." "You dropped out," Langston said quietly. "I didn't drop out. I disappeared." Her voice cracked. "I blocked the school's number so they wouldn't call and tell her. She would have tried to go back. She would have hurt herself worse. I cleaned the house while she rested. I took the night shift at the diner. $11 an hour." Langston stared at the road. His face, normally so composed, had hardened into something unreadable, something old. "You gave up everything," he said. Zariah laughed softly. It was a joyless sound. "What good is a future if I don't have her in it?" He didn't respond. Instead, he pulled the car gently to the side of the road and parked beneath a flickering street lamp. The street was quiet, lined with empty storefronts and drawn blinds. He turned on the interior light. It cast a soft, golden glow inside the car. "Let me see your hand," he said. She hesitated. "It's fine. Let me see it." Slowly, she extended her arm. He took her hand in his, careful not to press too hard against the swelling. Her fingers were cold, skin cracked at the knuckles. "This isn't fine," he muttered, pulling out the first aid kit again. "This is how infection starts." He disinfected the wound again, his hands steady. Zariah winced. "My brother," he said softly, not looking up, "once told me that it's always the smallest wounds that turn into something worse if you ignore them." He wasn't talking about cuts. She looked at him. The name sat on the edge of her tongue, unspoken. "Tommy." He wrapped her hand slowly, gently. When he was done, he held it a moment longer. "This should have never been your burden," he said. She looked away. "It was never a choice." He released her hand and turned off the light. The warmth of it lingered. "You remind me of someone," he said, starting the car again. "Someone I lost." She didn't ask who. She didn't have to. The rest of the drive passed in silence. But it was different this time. Not heavy with shame, but thick with something else: recognition. A thread between them that hadn't existed an hour ago. When they pulled up in front of her apartment building, she didn't move right away. "This is where we live," she said. "3rd floor. No elevator. I know, Langston said. I was here earlier today. Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. You are very much like your mother, he said. She turned toward him. She lied to you. So did you. Her lips pressed together. You're both terrible liars, he added, a faint smile touching his mouth. A small laugh escaped her. Brief, but real. You're also both very proud, and your pride is killing you. She opened the door. The night air rushed in. Thank you, she said softly. Langston looked at her, his face gentler now. You're not alone in this anymore. She stepped out and closed the door. He watched her limp toward the building, her back straight despite the weight she carried. Then, for the first time in a long time, Edward Langston leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes not from exhaustion, but from clarity. Edward Langston had made a decision, not the kind of calculated, strategic decision he was known for in boardrooms and on Wall Street. This one didn't involve risk assessments, stock valuations, or market forecasts. It was older, deeper, something that stirred in his chest and settled like a vow. The next morning, before the fog had lifted from the bay, he arrived at the Bell apartment. This time, he didn't send George. He came himself, dressed in a tailored but modest charcoal suit. No tie, no security detail, just Edward, a cup of hot tea in one hand, and a folder tucked beneath his arm. He climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor, past peeling paint and cracked railings, past the faint scent of fried food and old shoes. When he knocked on the door, it wasn't with impatience. It was with intention. Gloria Bell opened the door slowly, leaning heavily on the frame. Her face was thinner than he remembered. Her hair, once neatly pulled back, now curled at her temples with fatigue. She blinked in surprise, adjusting her bathrobe. Mr. Langston? She rasped, voice rough from sleep and illness. Is everything all right? No, Gloria, he said gently. It's not. May I come in? She hesitated, then stepped aside. The apartment was modest and spotless. A faded couch sat beneath a window that looked out on a fire escape. A coffee table held a single photo album, its corners worn. The kitchen was small, the floor swept, the sink dry. Edward glanced around before offering her the tea. Lemon and honey. You always drank it during the winter staff meetings. Gloria took it, stunned. You didn't have to. Yes, I did, he said simply. She lowered herself into the recliner. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the cup. Edward remained standing. I know about the lupus, he said. I know you lost your second job. I know Zariah dropped out of school to keep you afloat. I know she's been working the night shift at a diner where the manager verbally abuses her. Gloria's eyes filled with tears. I tried. I told her not to. But she wouldn't listen. I told her not to. She listened, he replied. She just didn't believe there was another way. Gloria bowed her head. I also know, Edward continued, his voice quieter now, that you're Robert Bell's daughter. Her head snapped up. He served with my brother in Vietnam. He was the medic who pulled Tommy out after the ambush near Khe Sanh. I have the letter he wrote to my mother. Your father didn't just serve, he saved lives. Gloria's eyes softened. He never talked about it, said it wasn't something you brag about. Edward nodded. It's not. He walked to the window and stared out at the fire escape, where a tattered wind chime made soft sounds in the breeze. I owe your family more than a job, he said. I owe a debt that's long overdue. Gloria wiped her eyes. I don't want charity. This isn't charity, he said, turning. It's legacy. She looked at him, her eyes wary. I've already spoken to Dr. Trammell at St. Joseph's, he continued. They specialize in autoimmune treatment. I've arranged for your transfer this week. Everything's covered: treatment, transportation, medication. No red tape. No bills. Gloria choked on a sob. And Zariah, he added, will be reinstated at school. I've contacted Georgetown, explained the situation. They're reviewing the scholarship suspension. With a little push, she'll be back on track before winter term. Gloria covered her mouth with one hand, trembling. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Don't say anything, Edward said. Just let me fix this. There was a knock at the door behind him. Gloria blinked. That must be the nurse, Edward said. I asked her to stop by, just to evaluate. You don't need to do this alone anymore. Gloria didn't answer. She just nodded, tears spilling freely now. Later that afternoon, Edward returned to his estate. George was waiting in the study. She agreed? The assistant asked. Edward nodded. She didn't want to, but she understood. And Zariah? She doesn't know yet. I want to tell her myself. George handed over a document. This came from Georgetown. Her application, essays, letters of recommendation, impressive stuff. Edward scanned the page. One essay, titled When the System Fails, We Don't Have to, caught his eye. He read the first line aloud. I've never believed in heroes, only people who show up when no one else does. Edward closed the folder. We're going to make sure she gets to keep believing that. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he stood in the tall window of his study, looking out over the estate he had once built as a monument to solitude. Now, it would become something else. Zariah didn't recognize the car when it pulled up outside her school. It was a sleek silver Lincoln, polished to a shine, with blacked-out windows and quiet tires. She stood frozen at the sidewalk, her tattered backpack over one shoulder, unsure if she should walk or run. It wasn't the kind of car that came to her part of town, and definitely not the kind that stopped for girls like her. Then the back window rolled down. Get in, Edward Langston said simply. His voice was calm, but not cold. Zariah looked around nervously. What? Why are you here? You missed your 10 a.m. meeting with the principal. I didn't. She stopped. How do you know about that? I made the appointment. She hesitated, then opened the door and slipped inside. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and something older, expensive like leather and old books. I told you I can handle this, she murmured. Langston didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead. And I told you, you don't have to. The car eased into motion. Zariah clutched the straps of her bag. Her bandaged hand throbbed gently beneath the pressure. They rode in silence for a while. The city passed them by street vendors, laundromats, tired brick buildings with cracked windows. This wasn't Langston's world, but he didn't flinch from it. Your mother is scheduled for a consultation at St. Joseph's tomorrow, he said without turning his head. Zariah stiffened. You went to my house? I brought her tea and help. She turned her face away, lips pressed tightly together. You had no right. I had every right, he said. Your father saved my brother's life. Your grandfather saved his soul. I've spent decades building something I thought was untouchable. But I forgot the debt I owed. Zariah swallowed hard. My mom didn't want you to see her like that. I didn't see shame, Langston replied. I saw strength, worn to the bone. Nah. The car pulled into a parking space outside North Bay High. The building loomed tall, its brick facade chipped and sun-bleached. Students were already filing out for lunch. Edward turned to face her. Do you know what happens to a girl like you without intervention? He asked softly. Zariah didn't answer. You disappear. One missed class becomes 3. 3 becomes a record. Then they start labeling you unreliable, at risk, statistical dropout. And then they forget your name, but not your file. She bit the inside of her cheek. I won't let that happen, he said. Zariah looked at him, her voice tight. You think you can just fix everything because you have money? No, Langston said. I know money doesn't fix everything, but it can stop the bleeding long enough for real healing to begin. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and handed her a folded paper. She hesitated, then opened it. It was a reinstatement letter. Georgetown University. Full scholarship. Reactivated. Tears filled her eyes. I don't deserve this. Maybe not, he said. But neither did I, when Robert Bell dragged my brother to safety through 2 miles of enemy fire. Some things, Zariah, aren't about deserving. They're about doing what's right. She stared at the letter. Her hand trembled. You should go in, he said, nodding toward the school. Let them see you haven't disappeared. Oh, Zariah looked down at herself, her wrinkled shirt, her patched jeans, the bruises still fading on her shins. I don't look like someone going back to Georgetown. Langston smiled faintly. You look like someone who survived. They'll remember that longer. She stepped out of the car, her backpack heavier than usual, but not from books, from hope. Edward watched her walk toward the building, her gait slow but determined. She didn't look back. Later that evening, Langston sat in his study again. the fireplace crackling quietly. George stood by the shelves, holding a file. "You were right," he said. The principal said no one had fought harder for their education in years. Zariah was known for tutoring other kids after school. She ran the debate team, helped clean classrooms on Fridays. She never said any of that. Edward murmured. "Didn't think it mattered," George said. "Kids like her learn not to talk about what they carry." Edward stared into the flames. "She does now." He leaned back in his chair and opened the photo album Gloria had given him earlier that day. Inside, a black and white photo of Robert Bell holding a baby girl in his arms. Behind them stood a younger Gloria, smiling. A family built on sacrifice. The weight of old debts pressed against Edward's shoulders, but for the first time, it didn't feel crushing. It felt anchored. He closed the album slowly and whispered to himself, "No more secrets." Mo. It was supposed to be a quiet day. Zariah had returned to school, holding her head high even as whispers chased her down the hallway. Not all of them were cruel, some were confused, others curious, but in the brutal world of high school, even curiosity could cut like glass. "Did you hear she dropped out?" "No, she's back now. Something about her mom being sick? I saw her crying in the counselor's office." She's working at that sketchy diner on 14th. My cousin saw her cleaning the bathrooms." Zariah kept walking, one foot in front of the other. Georgetown's letter, now laminated and folded neatly in her bag, was her silent shield. She made it to her first-class civics before the weight of everything threatened to drag her under. The teacher, Mr. Halverson, a round man with a worn corduroy jacket, looked up from his attendance sheet and smiled gently. "Good to see you back, Zariah," he said. She nodded. "Thanks." The lesson was about justice, constitutional rights, systemic failures, checks and balances. Irony, she thought, was a better teacher than any textbook. When the bell rang, she packed up quickly, not waiting for eye contact or small talk. In the hallway, she spotted her old friend, Josie. They'd once been inseparable, but illness and night shifts had a way of erasing even the strongest ties. Josie hesitated, then waved. Zariah offered a soft, almost apologetic smile. Baby steps. But peace was never meant to last. Not that day. It happened in the cafeteria. She was walking past the vending machines when she heard it sharp, unmistakable, and loud enough to freeze the air. "Oh look, the maid's back." Zariah stopped. 3 girls stood near a table, all polished and dressed in boutique fashion. Their hair perfect, their sneakers spotless. Becky was in the middle, the ringleader. Always. Her voice dripped with privilege and something colder. "Didn't you quit school to go full-time with the Langstons?" she said. "What? Did they fire you already?" Zariah didn't answer. "Hey," Becky continued, stepping forward, eyes glittering. "You missed the college prep meeting. But I guess you're not planning on that anymore." Zariah clenched her jaw. "She's got better things to do," another girl snickered. "Like cleaning Mr. Langston's crystal at 2 a.m. My dad says rich men keep people like her around for a reason." That one landed like a slap. Zariah turned slowly. Her voice was calm, almost frighteningly so. "You don't know anything about me." Becky laughed. "I know you used to think you were better than us. Honor cords, debate team, all that noise. But we all knew where you'd end up." Zariah stepped closer. "What I do for family." "What do you do? Wait for your daddy's money to buy you a future?" The tension in the room thickened. Students nearby paused mid-bite, mid-sentence. Something was about to happen. Becky scoffed. "Don't act like a hero, Zariah. You're a charity case with a fancy pity letter from Georgetown." "That's all." Zariah's eyes didn't blink. "I earned my spot." "Did you?" The silence after that was nuclear. Becky's face flushed deep red. "Watch your mouth." "Or what?" Zariah asked. "You'll call your lawyer?" Before Becky could reply, a staff member appeared, sensing trouble. "Ladies, everything all right here?" Zariah didn't wait. She turned and walked away, her hands trembling, her breath shallow, but she didn't cry. She didn't cry. That afternoon, as she exited the school gate, Langston's car was there again, waiting. He had said he'd only come when necessary. Apparently, today was necessary. She got in without a word. He didn't speak right away either. "You heard," she finally said. "I did," Langston replied. "It's already being handled." "How?" she asked, her voice brittle. "You can't buy dignity, Mr. Langston. Zero." "No," he said, "but I can protect yours." She looked out the window, her throat tight. "They hate me. I was gone 3 weeks, and it's like I became a ghost. Now that I'm back, they want to erase me all over again." Langston's voice was quiet. "Do you know what the most dangerous type of person is?" She shook her head. "The one who refuses to stay down when they're expected to." She turned toward him, surprised. "They'll talk," he said. "They'll mock, but soon they'll watch. Because when someone rises, people always watch." He handed her an envelope. She opened it. Inside was a student ID for a private mentorship program in Washington, D.C. A prestigious summer program for high school seniors pursuing law, policy, or diplomacy. Her name printed on it. "Accepted, fully funded." She gasped. "How?" "They called me yesterday," he said. "I sent your application and essay. Under a pseudonym, no name. They accepted on merit alone." Zariah stared at the ID. It was real. "Not a promise. A path." Are you doing this for my grandfather?" she asked suddenly. "Or because you feel guilty?" Edward Langston looked at her. And for once, the man behind the billions, the strategist, the titan softened into something else. "I'm doing this," he said, "because no one did it for my brother." Zariah held the card tightly, like it might vanish. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was starting to live. Zariah stood at the kitchen sink that evening, the sounds of simmering rice and boiling greens filling the small apartment. Her mother was resting in the bedroom after her first real visit with a nurse, an experience that had left her both exhausted and oddly hopeful. The nurse had spoken kindly, respectfully, calling her ma'am, and promising she'd be back tomorrow with new medication. For the first time in weeks, Gloria had fallen asleep without pain etched across her brow. Zariah looked out the tiny window above the sink. The sky was a burnt orange, streaked with purple, the kind of sunset she rarely noticed anymore. The world was still turning, even when hers had been on pause for so long. There was a knock at the door. She dried her hands quickly, heart skipping. Visitors were rare, too rare. When she opened the door, Edward Langston stood on the other side, not in a suit this time, but in a windbreaker and pressed slacks. He looked less like a billionaire, and more like someone's quiet uncle from out of town. He held a large, weathered envelope. "I need to show you something," he said. She stepped aside wordlessly and let him in. He walked into the living room and paused before placing the envelope gently on the table, like it contained glass. "This was sent to me," he said, "from an address in upstate New York. No return name." She looked at him, confused. "What is it?" Langston nodded toward the envelope. Something that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. With careful fingers, Zariah opened the flap. Inside was a stack of handwritten letters, faded with time. On top, a folded piece of yellowing paper, marked with military insignia. She sat down slowly, pulling it out. The handwriting was strong, old-fashioned, masculine. She began to read. The 12th of March, 1971. "Dear Mrs. Langston, I am writing to tell you what your son meant to us. He wasn't just brave, he was kind. He shared his rations when others wouldn't. He stayed awake on watch for hours longer so a scared rookie could sleep. He died saving my life." Zariah stopped. Her voice caught. Langston's voice was low. "That letter was from your grandfather, Robert Bell. He wrote it to my mother after my brother was killed. She kept it until the day she died." Zariah's hands shook as she turned the page. "Why now?" "There's more," he said. Beneath the letter were photographs, old Polaroids, and military snapshots. One showed 2 men, their arms around each other, grinning under a tattered American flag. One was clearly Edward's brother, Tommy Langston. The other, a tall black man with solemn eyes and a crooked smile, was unmistakably Robert Bell. And then she saw it, a different letter, addressed to Edward Langston. "Edward, you don't know me, but I know you. I held your brother's hand when he died. He made me promise I'd tell you to never let the world break your heart, even when it doesn't deserve you, he said. Tears blurred Zariah's vision. Langston leaned forward. I never got that letter. My mother never gave it to me. I found it tucked between pages of her Bible after she passed. Zariah pressed her hand to her chest. Overwhelmed? Why would she keep it from you? Maybe she thought she was protecting me. Or maybe she couldn't bear to share the weight of her grief. He paused. But the words in that letter, they stayed with me. They reminded me who I was supposed to be, who I've failed to be for too long. Zariah closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. So why bring them to me? Because you deserve to know where you come from, he said softly. Your grandfather wasn't just a good soldier. He was the kind of man who gave meaning to sacrifice. Zariah ran her fingers over the paper, then looked up at Langston. Do you ever think things happen for a reason? Langston nodded slowly. I used to think life was just a series of transactions. Give and take. Win and lose. But now I think maybe some debts are meant to be paid with time, not money. Zariah sat back, the letters spread out before her like sacred texts. The pieces of a history she never knew she had tied not just to blood, but to promises, to pain, to people who showed up when no one else did. I want to do something, she said suddenly. Langston raised a brow. What kind of something? I want to tell his story, she said. My grandfather's, my mother's, everything. I want people to know what's behind those names on a wall or in a file. I want to study history not just to learn it but to change how it's remembered. Langston smiled faintly. That's a noble mission. It's more than that, she said, her voice gaining strength. It's the only one that makes all of this mean something. He stood and gently laid his hand on her shoulder. Then you'll have everything you need. I'll make sure of it. And just before he turned to go, she called out to him. Mr. Langston. He stopped. Thank you, not just for the school or the help, but for showing up. He met her eyes. Thank you for letting me. The Langston Foundation headquarters sat like a glass cathedral in downtown Washington, D.C. Tall, sleek, and intimidating. Inside its marble lobby, conversations echoed between tall columns and modernist art installations. But behind the polished veneer, something far less decorative was brewing. Edward Langston sat at the head of the conference table on the 42nd floor. Around him were 7 board members, all older white men in custom suits, and one woman with steel gray hair and sharper eyes than anyone else in the room. The meeting had been called under the guise of quarterly reallocation of funds, but Edward knew better. This was about Zariah. About him. And about the quiet fury building beneath the surface of his empire. Edward, began Harold Price, a man with a voice like a courtroom gavel. We've noticed recent expenditures outside the standard grant pipeline. Health subsidies, educational funds, private scholarship extensions. He didn't mention names, but everyone at the table knew. Langston didn't flinch. Correct. And these weren't brought before the board, Price added, steepling his fingers. They weren't budgeted. Langston leaned forward, elbows on the polished oak. They were necessary. Necessary to whom? Asked Sylvia Tran, the only woman in the room. A private citizen? A former housekeeper's daughter? Langston's eyes narrowed. To a promise I made. There was a pause. She's not a public case, Edward, said another board member, Thomas Ellery. There's no PR value here, no media angle. We're a foundation, not a rescue service. Langston rose slowly from his chair. Do you know why the Langston Foundation exists? Murmurs, shrugs, shifts of discomfort. Because a soldier saved my brother's life 54 years ago. Because that soldier's family was later abandoned by the very system he fought for. Because his granddaughter is now clawing her way through a society designed to forget her. That is why this foundation exists. No, he paused. It's never been about press releases. Price sighed. Edward, I respect your passion, but if this turns into a personal crusade, it already is, Langston interrupted. And if anyone here finds that objectionable, I'll be happy to buy out your seat before lunch. Silence. Then Sylvia, without breaking eye contact, said softly, You're changing the mission. No, Langston replied. I'm finally honoring it. After the meeting, George met Edward in the private elevator. "Well," George muttered, "you just shook the pillars of philanthropy." Langston smirked. "Good. They needed rattling." He handed George a folder. "I want everything Zariah will need for the DC mentorship program. Handled flights, lodging, stipends, no delays." George opened the folder. "Already in motion. She starts in 3 weeks." Langston stepped out into the executive parking lot, feeling something unfamiliar pulsing in his chest. Resolve, not as a burden, but as direction. Meanwhile, across town, Zariah was on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by books and notes. Her laptop screen glowed with readings on civil rights, protest movements, and legislation that had failed more often than it succeeded. She wasn't reading just to catch up on missed schoolwork. She was preparing. Next to her, the Georgetown reinstatement letter sat framed on the nightstand. Below it, a small black and white photo of her grandfather in uniform, grinning into the Sunday. The words Edward had said at dinner the week before still echoed in her mind. "You're not a problem to fix. You're a story to amplify." She stared at her notepad. On it were scribbled outlines for a new essay she wanted to write, one she planned to submit to the mentorship program, even though her acceptance was already secured. The title she'd circled 3 times. We were never the footnote. That weekend, Edward surprised her again. He picked her up early Saturday morning, not in the Lincoln, but in an old white pickup truck that looked suspiciously like it hadn't been driven in 10 years. "Is that yours?" Zariah asked skeptically, backpack slung over one shoulder. Langston adjusted his driving gloves. "It was my father's. He believed in manual labor, hard wheels, and country roads." They drove west, leaving the city behind. The landscape turned into rolling hills, rust-colored barns, and long-forgotten gas stations. After 2 hours, they pulled into a dusty gravel driveway leading to a modest white house, surrounded by trees and silence. Langston turned off the engine. "This was Tommy's," he said quietly. "He bought it before he left for Vietnam. Never got to live in it." Zariah stepped out slowly, her sneakers crunching on the gravel. Langston opened the door and let her inside. Dust motes swirled in the light through the windows. The furniture was old, but preserved. A quilt still covered the sofa. Framed letters and medals adorned the wall. Zariah walked the space like it was a church. "He would have loved you," Langston said. "You remind me of him, not just the stubbornness, the fire." She touched a photo on the mantel. Tommy in uniform, his arm around a younger Edward. "Why bring me here?" Langston exhaled. "Because I wanted you to see that this isn't just about debt or duty. It's about connection, the kind that stretches beyond time and blood." "Oh." He looked at her, eyes heavy but clear. "You've got more than just a scholarship, Zariah. You've got a legacy." She nodded, her voice quiet. "Then I won't waste it." Langston looked out the window at the hills beyond. "I know you won't." 3 days later, the weather shifted. Thick gray clouds blanketed the DC sky, and rain came down in angry sheets, turning sidewalks into rivers, and draining the color from the world. It was the kind of storm that soaked you to the skin in seconds and made the city feel heavier, older. Zariah stood on the steps of the community library, her coat clutched tight, trying to balance her bag, umbrella, and the stack of research papers Edward had printed for her. She was supposed to meet a professor from the mentorship program for a prep session, a one-on-one conversation about narrative framing and public policy storytelling. The kind of opportunity kids usually had connections to access. Zariah had earned hers the hard way. But she was late. The bus had stalled in high water near 12th Street. Then, she'd stepped into a pothole disguised as a puddle and soaked her sneakers through. Her throat burned. Her hand, still recovering, ached from the cold. By the time she entered the meeting room, dripping and flushed, the professor was already packing his notes. "I'm so sorry," she blurted, breathless. "There was a delay and—" "Miss Bell," the man interrupted, glancing at his watch. "We schedule these sessions with the understanding that time is mutual. You were 27 minutes late." "I know, but—" she began. "No buts," he said, slipping his folder into his briefcase. "Success in policy starts with respect. For the work, for the process, for the people." Zariah stood frozen, ashamed. "I'll reschedule when your time reflects your commitment," he said with finality, and walked out into the rain. She stood there for a full minute. the fluorescent light buzzing faintly above her. Her wet shoes squeaked as she moved to the nearest chair and sat down hard. She blinked back the heat behind her eyes. She had survived worse. She had. But some days the little failures hit harder than the big ones. They carried the weight of doubt like a whisper she couldn't silence. You don't belong here. Across town, Edward Langston sat at his desk, a rare expression of worry pulling at the corners of his mouth. The phone buzzed. Mr. Langston. George's voice came through the intercom. There's something you need to see. A moment later, George entered the study holding an iPad, his face tight. Someone's leaking information about Zariah, he said. Langston stiffened. From where? We don't know yet. But her name was mentioned on a conservative blog this morning. They're calling it special treatment, accusing you of nepotism, of reactivating her scholarship as a publicity stunt. He handed over the tablet. Langston read in silence. A grainy photo of Zariah walking out of his car was attached. The caption read, "From maid to mentored, Billionaire's pet project, or something more." He closed the iPad slowly. How long until it spreads? By morning, probably everywhere. Langston exhaled through his nose. Find the source. Now, quietly. George nodded. And Zariah? I'll handle her, Langston said. But before he could call, his phone buzzed again. It was Zariah. Mr. Langston? Her voice was small, uncertain. I'm here. Do you have a minute? Always. She hesitated. Can I come over? Already on my way, he said. They met in the study, fire crackling as rain streaked the tall windows. Zariah sat curled into a corner of the leather couch, a blanket around her shoulders. Her hair was damp, her voice flat. I messed up today, she said. You didn't, he replied. I was late, and the professor treated me like I didn't belong. She stared into the flames, and for a moment, I believed him. Langston leaned forward. Zariah, these systems weren't built for you to thrive, but your very presence forces them to reckon with their own limitations. That discomfort isn't your failure, it's their fear. She looked up at him. Then why does it still feel like mine? Because you're holding yourself to a standard that was never made for you, he said. You don't need to play their game. You're rewriting the rules. He handed her the iPad. She read the blog silently. When she looked up, her face was unreadable. Is it true, she asked. What? That people will always see me as someone you helped out of guilt. Langston walked to the window, his back to her. I've built a legacy based on power and precision. I'm not ashamed of that, he said. But you're not a symbol, Zariah. You're a spark. And sparks don't beg for permission. They light fires. He turned around. Let them write their stories. You'll write yours louder. She stared at him, something changing in her eyes. I want to speak, she said suddenly. At the mentorship program's opening night, let them see me, hear me. I want them to know who I am before they decide what I'm not. Langston smiled. Then that's what we'll do. And in that moment, the storm outside faded into quiet, because inside, something stronger had taken its place. The event hall at the George Washington Center for Civic Leadership gleamed with polished wood floors and tall glass windows that overlooked the city skyline. Chandeliers glittered overhead, casting a golden glow over round banquet tables and rows of velvet chairs lined up before the stage. It was a night of prestige, designed to impress donors and dignitaries, the kind of event Zariah had only ever watched on television. But tonight, she wasn't watching. She was the one they'd be watching. Edward Langston stood near the back of the room in a tailored black suit, his expression unreadable. George stood beside him, scanning the room of politicians, professors, and press with a tactician's eye. In the crowd were faces Zariah had read about in textbooks, men and women who shaped policy, led universities, and dictated narratives. Zariah stood backstage, alone, her hands slightly trembling. She wore a navy blue dress Langston had arranged, simple but elegant, and her curls had been pulled back in a low twist that made her look older, stronger. She could hear the event coordinator's voice booming through the microphone. And now, we invite to the stage someone whose story defies assumptions and demands attention, Zariah Bell, a rising voice in the next generation of civic leadership. Applause. Zariah's heart hammered in her chest. Then she stepped onto the stage. For a moment, the lights blinded her. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw them all, some smiling politely, others with arms folded, skeptical. She took a deep breath and began. My name is Zariah Bell. I'm the granddaughter of a forgotten soldier, the daughter of a woman who cleaned homes so her child could one day sit in rooms like this. She paused, let the silence settle. I wasn't invited here because of a family name. I wasn't born into legacy or advantage. I was born into debt of history, of circumstance. I've cleaned dishes at 2 in the morning to pay for school books. I've watched my mother skip her medication so I could buy bus fare. And I've walked into classrooms where my last name was a question, not a credential. Some heads turned, others tilted. One man in the back nodded slowly. But I'm not here to ask for sympathy. I'm here to challenge something more dangerous than ignorance indifference. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. There are people in this room who write policies that never touch their lives, who decide the future of communities they've never stepped foot in, who look at girls like me and see charity, not change. A sharp intake of breath from the front row. I'm not your exception, she said. I'm your wake-up call. Langston watched her, his chest tight. It wasn't pride he felt. It was awe. She wasn't performing. She was becoming. Zariah continued, voice steady now. My story isn't just mine. It belongs to every child who's been told to wait their turn. Every mother who's worked 3 jobs and still come up short. Every student who studies in silence because they've been told they're lucky just to be in the room. She took a step forward. I don't want a seat at the table. I want to rebuild the table. The applause came slow at first, hesitant, then stronger, real. When she stepped down from the stage, several people reached out to shake her hand. A university dean offered his card. A journalist whispered that she'd be contacting her for an interview. But Zariah didn't pause for any of them. She walked straight to Edward Langston. Well, she asked, breath-catching. He looked at her for a long moment. You did something I never could. She raised an eyebrow. What's that? You told the truth, in front of people who make a living ignoring it. Zariah smiled, but it was laced with something sharper now, conviction. I'm not done. No, I know. That night, back at the apartment, Gloria Bell sat in her recliner, eyes misty after watching the live stream on George's laptop. Her daughter had spoken like a leader, like a survivor, like a legacy reborn. You made your grandfather proud tonight, she whispered. Outside, the storm clouds had passed, leaving the streets slick but clear, and for the first time in a long time, Zariah didn't just feel like she had entered the room. She felt like she owned it. The next morning, Zariah awoke to something unexpected silence. No distant sirens, no neighbors arguing down the hall, no coughing from her mother's room. Just sunlight streaming through the window and the soft hush of a city not yet fully awake. But peace never lasted long. She had just poured herself a cup of coffee when her phone buzzed. A message from George. Meet us at the Langston estate. Urgent. Her stomach dropped. When Zariah arrived, she was greeted not by Edward Langston, but by a stern-faced George, holding a manila envelope with no label. Where's Mr. Langston? She asked. In the study, George replied, guiding her inside. But before you go in, you need to see this. He handed her the envelope. Inside was a printed email thread, anonymous in sender and recipient, forwarded through multiple servers. It was written in coded terms, but the intent was unmistakable. A smear campaign, accusations about Zariah's scholarship, implications of an inappropriate relationship, claims she was a paid actress used to soften Langston's image. Her blood turned to ice. Where did you find this? She asked, eyes wide. George's expression darkened. It was leaked from inside the foundation. Zariah's breath hitched. Someone close? He nodded. Langston wanted to tell you himself. Oh. In the study, Edward Langston stood with his back to the door, staring out the window as if the answer were hidden in the trees. I never thought it would be him, he said, voice low. Who? Zariah asked gently. Langston turned. His face looked older than usual. Thomas Ellery, old friend, sat on the board for 23 years. Zariah blinked. The one from the meeting. The one who questioned your scholarship decisions? Yes, Edward said. He's been feeding stories to online outlets, framing you as a threat, framing me as weak. Why? She asked. Because I changed the rules, he replied, and when people can't control the new game, they attack the players. Zariah looked at the letter in her hands again. What do we do? Edward's jaw clenched. We prove them wrong. That afternoon, they convened in the Langston Foundation's main conference room. The entire board had been summoned, including Ellery. He sat across from Edward, lips pursed in mock confusion. Is there a reason we've been pulled in on short notice? Ellery asked coolly. Edward stood at the head of the table, Zariah seated to his right. In front of each board member was a copy of the email thread. Silence followed as they read. Someone within this board has taken it upon themselves to sabotage not only a student, Edward said, voice calm but sharp, but the integrity of this institution. Oh, Ellery leaned back, feigning indifference. I think this is all a bit theatrical. Edward turned to him. Then let's be clear. You leaked privileged information about a minor. You endangered her reputation, her future. And you did it using Foundation resources. That's a serious accusation, Ellery replied, but there was sweat on his brow now. It's not an accusation, George said, stepping forward. It's documented. Traced through server logs. Confirmed. The air went still. Edward placed a resignation document on the table. Your silence would have been enough. Your cowardice might have gone unnoticed. But your betrayal? That earns consequences. Ellery glanced at the other members. None defended him. He picked up the document, signed it, and left without a word. Zariah watched him go, her heart pounding. Edward turned to the room. This foundation will not serve power for its own sake. It will serve justice, equity. And if any of you have a problem with that, resign now. No one moved. Later, in the garden behind the estate, Zariah and Edward sat beneath the old oak tree, the same one Tommy Langston used to climb, according to family lore. He's gone, she said softly. Yes, Edward replied. Do you feel better? Edward considered that. I feel clearer. The air smells different when you pull rot out from the roots. Zariah smiled faintly. You really do talk like a southern poet sometimes. He chuckled. Comes with the hairline and the guilt. She turned serious. I thought I was done fighting. You're just getting started, he said. But now you know what you're fighting for. Zariah looked out at the horizon, at the sky stretching wide and deep, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was standing on borrowed ground. She felt like it was hers. It was a warm Friday evening when Zariah brought her mother to dinner at the Langston estate. She had insisted on it. Gloria had hesitated, naturally. I'm not about to sit at a billionaire's dinner table with my bad hip and no heels, she'd joked, but Zariah had seen the nervousness in her mother's eyes. Still, she'd agreed, pressed her hair back, put on her best lavender sweater, and carried herself like the woman who once fought off 2 jobs, sickness, and stigma just to keep her daughter in school. The moment they stepped into the foyer, Edward Langston came to greet them personally. He looked unexpectedly nervous. Mrs. Bell, he said warmly, taking Gloria's hand. I've been hoping for this day for a long time. Gloria's eyes narrowed playfully. I'd ask why, but I don't want to hear any nonsense about fate or paying old debts. Edward grinned. Then I'll just say, welcome home. The dining room had been set simply, but with quiet elegance. No staff. Just them. Langston had prepared the meal himself, or tried to. George had stepped in before he burned the salmon. As they sat, laughter flowed more easily than anyone expected. Gloria was sharp, funny, and unafraid to tease Edward like he was one of her church brothers. You got all these degrees and billions, but your seasoning's still suspect, she told him, holding up a fork with a smirk. Duly noted, Langston said, grinning. George told me to let go of the salt grinder. I didn't listen. Zariah watched them, her heart full. She wasn't used to seeing her mother laugh like this without pain, without fear. It made everything else melt away. But as dessert was served sweet potato pie, made by Gloria herself, Langston turned serious. There's something I've been meaning to ask, he said, looking between the 2 women. Gloria raised an eyebrow. This sounds like trouble. No, Langston said. Just truth. He took a breath. Would you allow me to establish a scholarship in Robert Bell's name for students like Zariah, first generation, underfunded, often overlooked? Zariah's eyes widened. Gloria didn't respond right away. Langston continued. It would be administered through the Langston Foundation, but separate from our general aid. It would honor service, sacrifice, and legacy. Gloria set her fork down slowly. Her voice was soft. "Do you remember him?" she asked. Edward nodded. "Only from pictures, stories, but the weight of what he did never left my family." Gloria looked at her daughter, then back at him. "Then make sure the scholarship doesn't just carry his name." "What do you mean?" he asked. "Make sure it carries his fight," she said. "He didn't just serve in uniform. He served when he came home, helped neighbors fix roofs, paid grocery bills for strangers. He lived like every person mattered." Edward nodded. "Then that's what it'll stand for." Zariah blinked back tears. She hadn't known that side of her grandfather, not fully. But she felt it now, alive in the room. Later, as they walked back to the car under the glow of the estate's porch lights, Gloria leaned on Zariah's arm. "You know," she said, "your grandfather would have liked that man." Zariah smiled. "You think so?" "He's still learning," Gloria said, "but he's trying. That counts for something." Zariah looked up at the stars, her heart steady. Everything had once felt so impossible. Now, it was beginning to feel inevitable. It was nearly midnight when Edward Langston's private line rang. He rarely answered calls after 10, especially from unknown numbers, but something in the gut told him this wasn't one to ignore. He picked up. "Langston." A pause. Then a voice distorted slightly, either by poor signal or by design. "You think you're helping her," the voice said, "but you're only painting a target on her back." Click. Langston stood frozen, the dial tone humming like a warning in his ear. The next morning, the Langston estate's security protocols were upgraded again. George coordinated with private cyber teams, increased internal surveillance, and restricted visitor access to verified contacts only. But no one, not even George, could trace the call. They used a burner routed through 5 proxy networks. George reported grimly, "Whoever they are, they've done this before." Langston didn't say a word. Instead, he pulled a thick folder from his desk drawer. On it, in handwritten script, were the words, 1969, Bell, R. Across town, Zariah was deep in study. Her mentorship program was entering its final phase, preparing presentations and policy proposals for real-world lawmakers. She'd chosen a topic close to her heart, educational equity in historically red-line districts. When she presented her draft to her mentor, a retired congresswoman named Evelyn Morse, the woman leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "This section," Evelyn said, pointing, "about generational damage done through neglect. Where did you pull that data?" Zariah showed her the citations. Evelyn nodded, then sat back. "You know," she said, "I've read hundreds of policy briefs from interns twice your age. You write like someone who's already fought the battle." Zariah smiled, surprised. "Maybe I have." But that night, she couldn't sleep. Something Langston had said days ago kept tugging at her. Some debts are meant to be paid with time, not money. She thought about her grandfather, the letters, the scholarship, the secrecy, and something didn't quite add up. The next morning, Zariah returned to the Langston estate unannounced. George let her in, raising an eyebrow. "Miss Bell, everything all right?" "I just need a word with Mr. Langston," she said. Edward was in the study, sorting through documents. Zariah stepped in, her tone unusually sharp. "Why was there a sealed military folder on your desk yesterday with my grandfather's name?" Langston didn't look up right away. "I saw it," she added. The date said 1969, not 1970. 1. That's 2 years before he was supposed to have met your brother. Edward slowly closed the folder in front of him. "I was hoping to wait," he said. "Wait for what?" Langston gestured for her to sit. "What I'm about to tell you changes everything." What followed was a story buried deeper than either of them had expected. In 1969, Robert Bell wasn't just a soldier. He had been working covertly with a classified group of field operatives inside Vietnam, tracking black market weapons pipelines run by American contractors, the kind of operation the military never officially acknowledged. Tommy Langston had been involved not as a soldier, but as a whistleblower. He was documenting the corruption, Langston said, and your grandfather was protecting him. Zariah sat in stunned silence. They weren't just friends, Edward continued. They were partners. They were targeted. Zariah's voice was quiet. So the ambush that killed him, Langston nodded, wasn't an accident. Zariah's stomach turned. Why hide this? Because exposing it back then would have buried both their names, erased their stories. She stood, pacing now. But if this is true, it is. Langston handed her the folder. Inside were records, redacted heavily, but clear in implication. Operation letters. Field notes signed, RB. With sketches and hand-drawn maps. A statement from Tommy Langston detailing internal theft of medical supplies and weapons. At the bottom, a photo, Tommy and Robert, not in uniform, but in civilian clothes, leaning over a coded notebook. They weren't just brothers in arms. They were truth-tellers, and they'd paid for it. Zariah's voice cracked. How long have you known? Langston's eyes darkened. Not long. I received this folder 2 weeks ago, anonymously. Zariah swallowed. You think the caller last night is connected? I'm sure of it. A beat passed. What do you want to do? She asked. Langston looked at her. The fire from her speech now mirrored in his own gaze. Finish what they started. Zariah barely slept. The folder sat on the table next to her bed, unopened since Edward handed it to her. Still, its contents pulsed in her chest like a heartbeat she hadn't known was there. Tommy and Robert hadn't died as soldiers lost to war. They had died as men who knew too much, trying to do what was right. And now, that unfinished business had landed in her hands. The next morning, she made her way back to the mentorship center. Her classmates noticed a change in her. She was still warm, still poised, but there was a steel to her stride now, something deliberate and unshakable. That week's assignment: prepare a 15-minute final presentation for a panel of DC advisors. Most students picked topics like education reform, climate initiatives, or healthcare access. Zariah chose something different. Her title: The Hidden War. When Truth Gets You Killed. Meanwhile, Langston had mobilized his private investigation team. Start with the source, he told George, spreading old documents and photos across his office table. Who was supplying the weapons? Who stood to lose if Tommy and Robert exposed them? George nodded. I've already reached out to a contact at the Pentagon. Quietly, Langston tapped his finger on the faded black and white photo of his brother and Zariah's grandfather. They trusted each other, put their lives in each other's hands, and were silenced for it, George added grimly. But not anymore. Zariah spent every night digging through historical reports, tracing the names listed in the folder, most redacted, but some partially visible. One name stood out: Colonel Mason Teller, a military advisor turned defense contractor, whose firm had ballooned in value after the war. She dug deeper. Teller's company had supplied field medics and weapons to U.S. bases in Southeast Asia between 1967 and 1971. There were whispers, buried news clippings, half-erased blogs suggesting that some shipments had gone missing, then reappeared in black market circles. Every time someone tried to push for an investigation, the trail went cold. Zariah printed it all. If this man had orchestrated the cover-up, and he was still alive and wealthy, it meant someone had everything to lose. And now that she and Edward were asking questions, someone knew it. 2 nights before her final speech, someone tried to break into her apartment. They didn't take anything. They didn't leave fingerprints. Just a single envelope taped to her bedroom wall. Inside, a photo of her grandfather's gravestone, with the words, "Let it lie." Zariah's hands shook as she called Langston. "We're too close," he said, voice low. Zariah didn't flinch. "Good." Langston paused. "You sure you want to keep going?" "I have to," she said. "If we stop now, it's not just silence. It's surrender." The day of her speech arrived. The event was held in the Roosevelt Civic Hall, a place where policy dreams went to either bloom or be buried. A crowd of professors, politicians, journalists, and past alumni filled the room. The lights were soft, but the eyes were sharp. Zariah stepped onto the stage. She looked calm, but inside, a storm churned. "I'm here to talk about justice," she began, "and the many ways it's been delayed, buried, or erased." She clicked to the first slide, 2 names: Robert Bell, Thomas Langston. This is a story of two men. One black, one white. Friends. Soldiers. Whistleblowers. She told them everything. Not names the press had invented, but truths the government had hidden. About stolen supplies, falsified records, about loyalty that crossed color and creed, about sacrifice that never made the evening news. She ended with the image of the anonymous photo she'd received. "Someone told me to let it lie," she said. "But the truth isn't something we bury. It's something we build from." There was silence when she finished. Then, thunderous applause. Afterward, Edward found her backstage. His eyes were glassy, but his voice was strong. "You did it." Zariah shook her head. "We did." He handed her a folder. "A federal inquiry is opening. Into Colonel Teller. Into the supply records. Into everything." Zariah took the folder. "How?" "I made some calls. So did a few others in the room tonight." He smiled. "Turns out, your truth was louder than their fear." Zariah clutched the file to her chest. Outside, camera crews waited. But for now, she was still. Still enough to feel the power of what they'd started. Still enough to hear the past whisper. "You carried it well." The news broke just after sunrise. Defense contractor under federal investigation for wartime misconduct. Vietnam-era whistleblowers spark modern reckoning. Student exposes cover, up that reaches decades deep. By noon, Zariah Bell's name was on every major outlet: CNN, The Washington Post, even NPR. She watched the headlines unfold not with pride, but with measured clarity. This wasn't fame. This was fire. And fire needed direction. At the Langston Foundation, Edward sat in a private strategy meeting with his legal counsel, a Pentagon liaison, and George. The tension was a live wire running through the room. "The inquiry will proceed under military tribunal jurisdiction," the Pentagon liaison explained. "Teller's legal team is already preparing to stall." "Let them try," Edward said, tapping a folder labeled DOJ Cooperation Agreement. The liaison sighed. "You understand. This is no longer a family matter or a scholarship redemption arc. This is federal, political. It could drag your name through every news cycle for a year." Langston didn't blink. "Good." George leaned in. "We also have to prepare Zariah. The closer we get to the truth, the more desperate they'll become." Edward nodded. "She's stronger than you think." Back in her apartment, Zariah stared at a stack of letters that had arrived that morning, some typed, others handwritten, some anonymous, others signed with trembling names. A letter from a retired nurse who had served at the same base in Vietnam. "We always knew something wasn't right. I remember your grandfather. He helped me save 2 boys the night the fire broke out." A note from a high school teacher in Mississippi. "I'm using your speech in my civics class. Thank you for making history breathe." She cried for the first time in weeks. Not from fear, from release. But the relief was short-lived. That night, someone slashed the tires of Edward's car in front of his Georgetown townhouse. No cameras caught the act. No alarms were triggered. Then came the second call. This time to Zariah's phone. No voice. Just an old Vietnam-era military cadence sung slowly, chillingly. One by one, they disappear. Zariah pressed her back against the kitchen wall, pulse pounding. She dialed Langston. "They're escalating," she whispered. "I know," he said. "We're moving you. Tonight." "Nah." Within hours, Zariah was relocated to a secure guest home in Northern Virginia, Langston's private retreat near the Blue Ridge foothills. The house was modest by his standards, but fortified like a modern fortress. No one knew she was there except George, Gloria, and Langston himself. "You'll stay until the hearing date is finalized," Langston said as he handed her a burner phone. "We're too close to let them intimidate you now." Zariah nodded. You're not," he said. "You're awake. That's different." In the stillness of that house, with only the crickets and wind for company, Zariah began writing again. Not speeches. Not policy briefs. Letters. One to her grandfather. "I finally understand what you risked. I hope I make you proud." One to Tommy Langston. "Your brother kept your fire alive. Now it's mine." And one to herself. "This is not where it ends." Die. Meanwhile, in Washington, Langston received a visitor, Evelyn Morse, the retired congresswoman and Zariah's mentor. "You poked a giant, Edward," she said as she stepped into his study. "And it blinked," he replied. Evelyn dropped a manila envelope on the table. "New evidence. Just came through unofficial channels. It's not just Teller. There were others. Names. Contracts. Photographic logs of the black market shipments. Some signed off by active generals." Langston's eyes narrowed. "How much can we prove?" "Enough," she said, "if we're brave." He looked toward the window, where storm clouds gathered again in the distance. "Then let's bring the thunder." Back in Virginia, Zariah stood outside on the porch, wrapped in a sweater, staring into the trees. Her phone buzzed. A message from Langston. "We present the evidence in 10 days. Prepare your final statement." She looked up at the sky, now lit with the faintest shimmer of morning light. 10 days to shake the country. 10 days to finish what two men began 50 years ago. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C., inside a chamber usually reserved for closed-door intelligence briefings. But this time, it was open to the press. Subpoenas had been issued. The Department of Justice was in full attendance. The room buzzed with anticipation, nerves, and the invisible weight of decades-old silence being shattered. Zariah stood in front of the mirror in a modest green blazer, no designer labels, no polished consultant touches. Just her, the granddaughter of Robert Bell, the girl who used to scrub dishes to pay for textbooks, the woman who now stood on the edge of history. Edward Langston waited at the entrance to the courthouse. When she arrived, he simply nodded. "They'll try to twist everything," he said. "I know. They'll raise their voices. I won't. They'll stare at you like you don't belong." Zariah turned to him, calm but certain. "I do." Inside, she sat next to Langston behind the panelist table. Evelyn Morse, now formally acting as counsel, organized the evidence binders in front of them. Across from them sat a wall of government officials, Pentagon representatives, and aging veterans, some whose names had been redacted in earlier documents but now stared back at her in the flesh. After preliminary statements, the lead counsel cleared his throat. "We now recognize Miss Zariah Bell for her prepared testimony." She stood. The room hushed. "My name is Zariah Bell. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a military official. I am not the descendant of anyone with a monument built in his honor. But I am the granddaughter of a man who told the truth when it cost him everything." She paused. "My grandfather, Robert Bell, worked alongside Tommy Langston during the Vietnam War. They uncovered a weapons smuggling operation run by U.S. contractors and sanctioned, or at least ignored, by high-ranking officials. When they tried to report it, they were marked. 2 weeks later, my grandfather was killed in what the government called an ambush, and Mr. Langston's brother was erased from every official ledger." She opened the folder. "Here is a copy of a field map drawn in Robert Bell's handwriting. Here are the redacted emails recovered from a whistleblower's archive. Here are photographs of shipments rerouted from medical supply stations to black market buyers signed off by Colonel Mason Teller and corroborated by an unnamed source at the time." She handed the packet to the clerk, who passed it along. "In the past few weeks, I've received anonymous threats. My family's gravesite has been targeted. But we are here anyway." Zariah looked up. "Because justice delayed is not justice denied unless we let it be." The chamber was silent. Then the cross-examinations began. A government official asked, "Are you implying the Department of Defense knowingly covered up a conspiracy?" "I'm not implying it," Zariah answered. "I'm proving it." Another man sneered. "How can you be sure your grandfather wasn't simply misinformed?" "Because liars don't take bullets for the truth," she said. "Cowards hide." He didn't. Langston watched with quiet awe. Her poise didn't falter. Her voice never cracked. Every time they tried to intimidate her, she stood taller. And when the committee called for a recess, no one could deny it anymore. She had moved the room. Outside the building, the media swarmed. Zariah stepped into the sunlight with cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward her face. "Do you think this will lead to convictions? Is this a political statement or a personal one?" "Why now?" Zariah raised a hand. "I didn't come here for a headline," she said. "I came here for history." That night, the Langston estate was quiet. Zariah sat on the porch beside Edward, the crickets loud in the Virginia dark. "You did something rare today," he said. "What's that?" You forced the world to stop and listen. Zariah turned to him. They're not done fighting us. Langston nodded. Good. Let them fight. They're out of shadows now. She looked up at the sky. Tomorrow would be full of editorials, talking heads, spin doctors trying to minimize what happened. But it wouldn't work, because something larger had been set in motion. A reckoning. The sun broke slowly over Washington, casting long shadows across the Lincoln Memorial steps. The air was brisk, the kind that carried clarity. On this morning, the National Commission for Truth and Service held a public ceremony honoring whistleblowers in military history, something that had never been done before. At the center of the gathering stood a new granite plaque, modest in size but immense in weight. Carved into its face were two names, Robert L. Bell, Thomas A. Langston. Below it, a simple inscription, for those who told the truth when silence was safer. Zariah stood before the plaque in a navy coat, gloves clutched tightly in her hands. Her mother, Gloria, beside her. On the other side, Edward Langston, wearing the same tie his brother had worn the day he enlisted. A small crowd gathered, veterans, journalists, teachers, students, and behind them, the quiet hum of a nation taking notice. A representative from the Justice Department stepped forward and handed Zariah an official letter. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Effective immediately, a full investigation into the Bell Langston records has resulted in the declassification of over 200 documents, a public apology from the Department of Defense, and formal recognition of both men's service. She let the words wash over her like rain after a long drought. Later that day, Zariah and Edward walked slowly through the gardens outside the Langston Foundation. They spoke less now. They didn't need words. I never thought we'd get here, Edward admitted. Zariah looked at him, because people like us weren't supposed to make it this far. He smiled, then stopped beneath the oak tree, the one where they had first spoken of legacy, of family, of unfinished stories. Zariah reached into her coat and pulled out a folded page. I found this, she said, in one of my grandfather's old books. She read, when the truth has no megaphone, it waits for a soul brave enough to carry it forward. She folded it again and tucked it into the bark of the tree. For the next girl, she said softly. In the weeks that followed, the Bell Langston Fellowship launched. Applications poured in from students across the country, many from small towns, broken homes, overlooked schools, the kind of students who never thought they'd matter to anyone but their own mothers. Zariah gave lectures, not to boast but to remind them that dignity was not a gift granted by the powerful. It was a right born with breath. Her story appeared in textbooks, in documentaries, but she never let it become a brand. She returned home every Sunday to cook with her mother, now back on her feet. They made sweet potato pie with extra nutmeg. Sometimes, they laughed until they cried. Sometimes, they just cried. One spring afternoon, Zariah sat alone on a park bench not far from the National Archives. She watched a young black girl, maybe 10, reading a book too large for her lap. Her lips moved silently as she mouthed each word. Zariah smiled. She didn't interrupt, because the best part of truth isn't that it's heard. It's that it's passed on. Final note from Zariah Bell, 7 years later. We never burned the system down. We did something harder. We stayed. We fought. We told the truth until someone listened. Then we kept telling it so no one could ever pretend they hadn't heard. This story isn't about justice delivered in full. It's about the cost of chasing it, and the sacred act of not giving up. This story reminds us that silence protects the powerful, but truth when carried with courage can change everything. Zariah Bell's journey teaches us that legacy isn't just about bloodlines or wealth, but about standing firm when the world tells you to sit down. Justice may be delayed, buried, or threatened, but when ordinary people choose not to back down, even buried truths rise. The story is not just about exposing corruption, it's about honoring the quiet strength of those who dared to speak, and inspiring the next generation to carry the torch further.